Computer. Okay. Oops. Why am I doing this one? No, this is not the right one. Okay, sharing, share. That should be this one, right? Okay. Okay, the book of Exodus. And I hope you have a chance to look at the videos. And the video is done by the Bible Project. I think that the Bible Project is a very good tool. They do a very good job by use of pictures, by use of animation, and show you then the overview. The Book of Exodus and covers two videos. They're very short, and I think they do a very good job in doing that. I do not know how many of you are familiar with the Book of Exodus, and you probably know the story a bit. Probably you have read the first part of Exodus, perhaps, and then somewhere after chapter 20, maybe you got stuck with all the details of the laws and the tabernacle and all that. And uh, sometimes I tell a story, and people start reading Genesis, and I want to start the and Bible reading at the beginning of the year, go to Genesis, very good, done. And then they come to Exodus, exciting with the story of Moses, the plagues, the deliverance, the Red Sea. And then when they came after the second part of Exodus, many of them died in the wilderness, and as the the people of Israel did, and they stopped there, and they never went on. And okay, now Exodus is the second book of the Bible, second book of the Torah. The Torah are the first five books, and the Jews call it the Torah. These are the primary and scriptures of the Jewish people. Yeah, they have the Tanakh, basically the entire Hebrew scriptures, but the Torah is the basic foundation of scripture for them. Uh, they consider the prophets, the Psalms. Those are basically supplements and still Word of God, but they basically and explain and put into expression the prayers, the songs. The prophets call them and preach their sermons and their reflections on the Torah. There's a group of Jews called the Sadducees at that time, in Jewish time, that only accepted and Torah, the Pentateuch. They do not accept the rest of the Jewish scriptures as authoritative. There's also another group at that time, the Samaritans, also largely accepted only the first five books, Samaritans, and their version is slightly different from the Jewish one. They have what we call the Samaritan Pentateuch. Today, there are a very small group of Samaritans. Sadducees have gone. They are no longer in existence. They have all of them. After the destruction of the temple, most of the Sadducees are priests and royal and noble families, and most of them basically no longer relevant when the temple no longer exists. But the Pharisees can basically continue what we call Judaism. And Samaritans continue to live in the area where it's called largely somehow the West Bank area. Today Samaritans, there are still some of them still around in the village or city of Nablus, and probably less than a couple of thousand Samaritans, and but they are still around. And okay, all right. The story of Exodus is quite simple. It shows how God delivered and rescued the Israelites from slavery and led them into the desert of Mount Sinai. Then in the desert, God handed down the laws to govern them and give them the instructions of how to build the tabernacle, not the temple, but the tabernacle, which is supposed to be the place where God and is worshipped, and God meets with the people, the sacrifices and all that, and the basic the worship of Israel. It is important to note that Exodus is not a standalone book. It is a continuation of the story of Genesis, and it basically continues the story, and then it leads on to Leviticus and Numbers. It is interesting to note that in the middle of Exodus and after chapter 20, when they come to Mount Sinai, and all the way down to Leviticus and Numbers, somewhere in the 10th chapter, it was a period of 10 years before they start moving again. And so it stretches, it is the second book of the 5 book and Torah. So we need to bear this in mind. So Exodus, we are only looking at a small portion of it. There are also a lot of it called and theological themes that is in this book. It's not just a story, a narrative, a history of how God delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt, but the sense of Exodus is one large thing about Exodus is a story about not so much about Israel, it's a story about God, who this God is, and God being the one and who called Abraham and led them all 2 years, and now he comes after seemingly a time of absence, so to speak, and but God is still with the people. In the first half of chapter 1, one of the noticeable things and that is found is in the absence of God. God seems somehow to have left the scene completely. And then much later in chapter 2, we find that the people cried to God and God remembered as if God forgotten. And but no, God is still behind the scenes. And even though God is not, there are not very many miracles. And in chapter 1, chapter 2, very ordinary thing. And unlike after and chapter 2, chapter 3, when you see a lot of miracles and all the judgments and all that, God is still present there. God is moving behind the scenes, and God has never really left the people. So his providential hand and works in very marvelous and very important ways. Okay, chapter 1 begins with this verse. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went into Egypt. The words in Hebrew, there are 6 words. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went down to Egypt. These are the exact words that you will find in Hebrew, at least, in Genesis chapter 26, chapter 46, verse 8. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went down to Egypt. Exactly the same in Hebrew. All right. I can show you. This is the verse in what we called in the Hebrew. And if you look at the one that's going back to then Genesis to Exodus, and these are the same words, exactly identical words. So in that sense, special sense, the writer then wants us to note this is very intimately related to Genesis. And it is also true because in our normal Bible, we say these are the names. But in the Hebrew Bible, you have the word and here. And these are the names. And so basically the and continues from the earlier book. And it's not a new book. It is a continuation. And these are the names of the sons of Israel. Reminder, these are the people who came down, and each with his family. And then they were listed: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob are numbered 70. Okay. And no, Joseph was already in Egypt. Okay. It's interesting to note that in the Greek text, the Masoretic text, you'll find that there's a note here. You say the Masoretic text is a Hebrew text, and is referred back to then Exodus 46 verse 27, and the number given there is 70. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Septuagint, which is also reflected in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 14, and also in Genesis 46, verse 27, the list is 75. So if you look at Acts chapter 7, and it says that after this, Joseph sent his father and Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. All right. And some people will ask, how come in the Exodus it is 70? Because we are using the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. The book of Acts, which is written by Christians, and the early Christians uses what we call the Greek Old Testament. And the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, and in that verse, it is different, slightly different. It shows 75. And in the Greek text of the Old Testament, in what we call Genesis chapter 46, verse 27, there were 5 additional names that were listed. And these were the grandsons and the great-grandson of Joseph. All right. In the Hebrew text, Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so together with Joseph and those who came down, altogether there was 70. But the Greek text considers 5 more. And these were the sons of Manasseh and Ephraim and the grandsons of Manasseh and Ephraim. So you have 75. So if people say there is an error, there's no error. Okay, it's just that the both and text and refer to Book of Acts refer to the Greek text, and the Hebrew text we have the reformers, what we call the Protestant church largely followed and the Hebrew text, and there's a difference between the Greek text and the Hebrew text that we have in the Masoretic text. But it's interesting to note that some Hebrew texts, especially in Dead Sea Scrolls, say 75. So there were additional names, and because those additional names included the additional grandson and great-grandsons of Joseph. All right, in case someone brings it up to you, nothing to do with the story here. And now, verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all their generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful and multiplied greatly, increasing in numbers, and so became numerous that the land was filled with them. This is another link with Genesis. And I think in the video that you saw, I think the video pointed out that as well, that is a link with Genesis, because God says to them in a number of times, I will be fruitful and multiply. And God and promise to Abraham, you'll be very fruitful. You'll be what we call the father of many nations. You'll have many children, many descendants, and so forth. And so this was a link and the fulfillment of God's promise, also a fulfillment of God's and command. They increase in numbers, and this is basically seeing that how the people of Israel, Jacob's family of Abraham, Isaac, has become a great people and were increasing and were seeing the blessing of God. But then, verse 8, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing. The other versions, the King James Version, a new king who do not know, and Joseph. It's unlikely that's what it meant, that this new king was ignorant of Joseph and didn't know anything about Joseph. And this is probably a few hundred years later. And for a people of 70 people to become a very numerous people, several thousands and hundreds of thousands of Hebrews at that time. And but I think that the NIV got it correct when it says that this new king, which come from a different dynasty and from an earlier dynasty, and a new what we call is like in Malaysia, when Pakatan and take over UMNO and all these things, and doesn't come anymore. Or when Trump became the president of US and the Democrats and Biden and Obama is all forgotten. It's erased and so passed in consideration. They mean nothing anymore. So this is a new power. And Joseph did not mean anything. And so the Hebrews and who had found favor with the Pharaoh that made Joseph prime minister now came to be looked at a different light. There was always the Egyptians do not really consider the Hebrews, the Israelites, and in a very positive light. They are somehow resented to it. And even in Joseph's time, the Egyptians don't eat with them, and they consider them shepherds, unclean, and things like that, and they look down upon them. But then Joseph is the second in command. He's powerful. He had the pharaohs and favor, and you don't go against the pharaoh. But now the old pharaoh has died. His family has died. His dad has died. Now you have a new kingdom, new dynasty, and so to speak. And so then things have changed. He said, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must do shrewdly with them, or they become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. And something this presupposes, or this new dynasty actually overthrew and the previous dynasties. And so they were chased out, and if their enemy come back, and these people will join with the old God, old people, the old dynasty, and become. So it's a political problem. It is a problem of what we call, are these Hebrews going to be loyal to us? Now that seems to be what we call the historical, the political, and the background, but there's a theological significance that the writer and whoever wrote Exodus. Many people traditionally believe that Moses wrote it. Maybe, but definitely not all the book of the Pentateuch, because he died, and in the later part. But I'm more of an opinion that even though probably Moses was a source of much of the primary material that goes back to him, and the final book of the Pentateuch or Exodus were written much, much later. Okay, so this Jewish writer and Israeli writer and see something here that God blessed Israel, God blessed the people, and they multiply and become numerous. But the Pharaoh is against it. he stands as a kind of anti-God. He is not only against the people of Israel, he is against God himself. These people have become too numerous, and he wants to reduce the population. And so, there are three things that he did. First, they put slave masters over them to oppress them for forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses and storehouses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, the more they spread. So the Egyptians became to be afraid of become dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. And some say, well, you treat them and thought that there's a way to reduce the population. No, they multiply even more. And so in verse 14, they made their lives bitter and harsh, and hard labor in brick and mortar and all kinds of works, and their harsh labor, the Egyptian root, and worked them ruthlessly. But that didn't stop them from growing and for multiplying and become a significant minority in a nation that could spell trouble for the dynasty, for the Egyptian. Then verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name was Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, the word delivery stool is kind of, we don't really know what a delivery stool is. Actually, the Hebrew means stones. And when you are helping the Hebrew children during childbirth on the stones, and does it make sense? A pair of stones. There's a very interesting reading, which is not accepted by any major translation. But some scholars says that the word stones could be a kind of a euphemistic and a reference to testicles. And sometimes in English we say, balls, and testicles. So basically, he's saying when you're helping the Hebrew children look at the stones, for the stones. And if it's if there's a stone, there's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. And so some translations just leave it out. Basically, have the translations that when you are helping the Hebrew children during childbirth, see if it's a boy or it's a girl, and just conveniently leave that kind of embarrassing note that is a delivery stool. What is a delivery stool? Nobody knows what it is, and it's a kind of a speculation. It's kind of a conjecture, and the other proposal then seems to be a little bit not so nice and or may offend certain people, but ancient people are very frank on some of these things, and they might use euphemism, but they basically referring, look, see is a boy or not, and look for the signs, things like that. But anyway, if you see it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why do you let the boys live? And the midwives answered Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not Egyptian women. They are vigorous. They are give birth before the midwives arrived. So God was kind to the midwives, and the children and the people increased and became even more numerous. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now, you must know that midwives lied, right? they didn't tell the truth. And some people, oh, okay. And it's okay to lie. Anyway, whatever you want to think about it, they actually lied to Pharaoh. Okay. Now, the Hebrew midwives. There is also this. Are they Hebrew midwives? That means the midwives who are the Hebrews or from Israel. Some scholars question whether these midwives are actually Hebrew midwives. In that they are Hebrew, and would the king of Egypt trust Hebrew midwives to carry out his command? Okay, So some scholars, a minority, not the majority, the minority says that Hebrew midwives could have another meaning. It means the midwives that were assigned to the Hebrew people, the Hebrew wives, and they are Egyptians. They are not Hebrew, but they are the Egyptians who do the midwife service to the Hebrew women. Okay, and of course, and he would call them. But again, they're not just two midwives. I think they cannot be just two midwives and to take care of the whole people. Probably they're representative, and maybe they are, and these are not necessarily, but this might be what we call two and of the many midwives that are over there. So that seems then logical. That seems possible because the language could simply mean they were the midwives to service and to take care of the Hebrew women. However, the problem is that the word Shifra and Puah are not Egyptian names. They are more Semitic names or more like not necessarily Hebrew names, but they are Asiatic names. They are Eastern and Asia, Near Eastern names rather than Egyptian names. So that counts probably against that. But there is even a smaller minority, I think two women scholars. One in Chicago, and the other one I didn't really find out where she's from, and wrote and said that in Egypt, there are not only Hebrews, and there are also other foreigners who are not Egyptians. And there are other Semitic peoples, and these Semitic peoples could be and specialists who are doing midwife kind of work, and they would be what we call they're neither Egyptian nor Hebrew, and they, in one sense, quite neutral, and but they're working in the Egyptian Empire, so it's likely that they would be what we called and someone that would what we called uh, the king, the pharaoh, and would use them, and they will be ones who are not what we call, if they are Hebrew midwives, would they actually be trusted and to kill and Hebrew children? And so I am more inclined to that these are non-Jewish, non-Hebrew, and as well as non-Egyptian, but another group of what we call Semitic and foreigners who were there to to do this kind of a work. But they might be God-fearers. They might be worship of God or whatever God, and they feared God in one sense and refused to carry out this dastardly work that the king does, killing innocent babies, innocent children. A midwife is to bring about life, not to kill life, and they refused to do that. And because they feared God, and God was kind to the midwives, people increased, even more numerous. So plan B and failed in the same way as plan A does. And then Pharaoh would to plan C, gave this order to all his people now. Every Hebrew boy that's born, you must throw into the Nile. But let every girl live. Okay. Again, there are some questions. Why just kill only the boys? Why not kill the girls too? And in one sense, the girls who are the ones who will give birth to many men. You kill all the girls and let the boys live, and especially if you need the boys and do what we call the slave labor and the building, all these things, they meant to kill all your potential men, and is what we call and killing off your task force and your laborers, your forced laborers, your cheap labor. And why would you want to do that? Maybe to kill the girls, and that'd be easier for that. Um, the Hebrews and the scholars, the Jewish scholars, thought very much about this and think that maybe and light and probably and in a way that going back and going forward to King Herod, and who was told that the king of the Jews was been born. There might be a prophecy that a deliverer of the Jewish people and will be born, and he wants to preempt that, and so he wants to kill the boys. Now that's very highly speculative, and but it came from some Jewish scholars themselves, and in the Middle Ages, maybe they have something, maybe they have not, maybe it's just interesting thinking, and but to throw them into the Nile. The Nile is significant because the Nile for the Egyptians represents life. It's a river of life. The Nile is the one every year it floods and so for them it's Mother Nile, the mother river, and to throw the Hebrew children into the Nile, and is kind of very dark, very scandalous. He didn't say it and strangle every male child and kill every male child, put their child to the sword, but throw them into the Nile. And that is terrible. That is evil, and that is significant, and basically turned the whole image of life into death kind of a scene. So Pharaoh is portrayed as the one who is not just taking care of a population that he's afraid of, that will be what we call cause trouble in his kingdom, but he is primarily portrayed as one who tries to oppose God, and God wants to be fruitful and multiply, and he wants to kill. And Jesus says, I've come that they may have life, but the devil comes to rob, to steal, to kill. And so you find that Pharaoh, for the very beginning, is portrayed as this evil antagonist against God. Okay. Now, when it comes to chapter 2, and now, there is this tribe of Levi. The man of Levi married a woman. She became pregnant again with a son. She saw that she was a fine child. They say that the Hebrew word is tough. And I think, and again, I think this is a link back to Genesis. And if you read Peter Enns, he will say the story of Exodus is what we call story of creation, and going back to Genesis. And when God created the heavens and the earth and all things, he saw and it was good. So this woman and went pregnant and gave birth to Moses, to a child, and saw he was good. And so again, there was this linguistic tie and to Genesis and at the beginnings Genesis 1 and good. And he hid him for 3 months, but he could no longer hide him any longer because and after 3 months the child began to be active, and you can't, and he'll be very hard to hide anymore. She got a papyrus basket. Now the word basket here is the same word for ark in Genesis. In fact, this word is only used in Genesis for Noah's Ark, and also the only time it's used is for this basket. Nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible is this word used. So again, just as Noah's Ark became God's instrument of salvation, so this basket, this ark, and was God's instrument of salvation for Moses, who became later the deliverer of the Jewish people. So again, you see, and how Exodus and Genesis are tied together with allusions, and in case then people reading it forget that it was continuation of the story of Genesis. There are these key words, there are phrases, there are certain elements, and so you find that this happens, and the story of and making the nation is a story of creation. Because just as in Genesis, later on, you read that, and when God divided the Red Sea, and it goes back again to Genesis, and God divided the waters above and the waters below, and made a firmament, and so there is that dividing. Then so you find that these are various what we call skillful allusions to the theology, to the understanding of the eyes of faith, who sees in these little details, in these little things, in these little stories, and to show that this is what God is doing, even though you find that God has not been even mentioned at this point. There's no reference to God at this point. Okay, but God, even though he doesn't seem to be mentioned, he seems to be absent, he's still behind the scenes. So there are no miracles. The salvation here for the saving deliverance of Moses was coincidental. There was no sudden what we call angel come and take the child, take him to the mountain where he was raised. So, and she put it into a plastic basket and coated it with tar and pitch. They're the same kind of materials that you have in Noah's Ark. And he placed the child in there and put it among the reeds along the river Nile. And the sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And then Pharaoh's daughter. I probably think that Pharaoh has many, many daughters. He has probably his harem, and is a lot of what I call wives, and she might not be the queen's princess, but one of Pharaoh's daughters came, and the Bible basically says Pharaoh's daughter came to the Nile to bathe. Her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket on the reeds, sent a female slave to get it. She opened and saw the baby. He was crying. She felt sorry for him. And she said, aha, this is one of the Hebrew babies. Because even though in the harem you know about Pharaoh's decree, throw all the babies into the Nile. And in one sense, Moses' mother did exactly what Pharaoh did, throw the baby into the Nile. Except that she didn't throw the baby into the Nile, but put the baby into the Nile and in the ark. And so technically you can say that she obeyed the command of Pharaoh. And so that is a kind of ironic and kind of a witty kind of a way that, yeah, I'm obeying the Pharaoh's and the command, but I'm not doing what he wants. And but technically I throw the baby into the Nile. Then, and that goes on, the sister came to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? And the princess would know that she could not get any Egyptian white nurse to nurse a Hebrew baby. They would know there's a Hebrew baby. And her attendants know that. And she cannot get any. So, and the sister came and says, will I get one of the Hebrew women to be a wet nurse for you? And she said, yeah, go. So the girl went and brought the baby's mother. Whether Pharaoh's daughter suspected it or not, the Bible never tells us. And the Pharaoh's daughter says, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. Okay. So not only she was able to save her son, she and her son, but she was paid to take care of her own son by the royal palace. And so the woman took the baby, nursed him, and when the child grew older, he took him to Pharaoh's daughter and became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now the Hebrew word and sounds like the Moses sounds like the Hebrew word to draw out. And that seems to be, but a lot of scholars pointed out, and there are problems with that, because that would assume that this Egyptian princess would know Hebrew, which possible, but quite unlikely. And to name the baby, give the baby with a Hebrew name, when you go back to the palace and your father, then who is a pharaoh, you found a baby and found a baby on the top here, and you name him, give him a Hebrew name, you endanger the child. Anyway, the word Moses is actually a very Egyptian name. There are what we call Tutmosis and Tutmuzi, and it basically has to do with and beget of who, and son of who, child of what, and so that is a more likely original than meaning, and probably Moses is a shorter name of some other name that was given and by the pharaoh's daughters and a child of somebody, of one of the gods or whatever it is, but was shortened probably to Moses. And but the writer and saw what we call and this name, and from a Jewish background, from a Hebrew background, was able to give a spiritual meaning to it, and so it sounds like being drawn out of water. So she named him, saying that I drew him out of the water, and that was his command. I don't think Pharaoh's daughters gave him Moses and say that I drew him out of the water. It was a command that was made by the writer who wrote this story. Okay? All right. Now, fast forward. How many years Moses growing up already? One day after Moses had grown up, became adult, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at the hard labor. This verse is interesting because, and the question that comes up, and I'm going to ask myself, does Moses know who he was? Okay, growing up in the Egyptian court. And did Moses somehow knew, or was he in ignorance of his ancestry? And he grew up Egyptian court, raised up to be Egyptian prince, maybe one of the lower princes and a noble house, and never and to be, but he will have to somehow royal education, things like that. And probably he's not that prominent anyway, because when God called him, he says, I am not a good speaker. I know, and to become a what we call the heir to the royal throne, and you need to be someone that is qualified. And so he's very unlikely because he's adopted anyway, and his ancestry, and maybe the king knows something suspected, and that he was Hebrew, maybe one of those, and but some scholars will also say that by this time, and it will seem that the order to kill all the Jewish children, all the Hebrew children, probably had been rescinded somehow, and because then we find that when it comes to Moses' time, there were all these Hebrew men that were there, and one way that some Jewish scholars were saying that perhaps, and some of Pharaohs and counselors were saying that stop killing the babies, and we need them for forced labor. In any case, and that so-called Messiah already by this time already born already. There's nothing I do. So killing the rest doesn't really make sense anymore, and it's destroying what we call our labor force and things like that. So maybe Pharaoh and accepted that, almost like Donald Trump, then okay, the counselor says that no, the nuclear plants are obliterated, no more, they cannot more and build any more nuclear weapons, and so let's have peace, and no more strikes, no more fighting, no more things like that, something like that, and it probably happened. So then so Moses, and even though he may be suspected as a Hebrew, what we call, then maybe the scriptures never tell us that whether he was, and but somehow you can suspect that rumors will be going, the princess and attendants would have gossiped, and so there were whisperings. But as long as he is still a prince of Egypt, nobody dared to do anything, and even pharaohs would not necessarily be too worried about him. Okay, so but did he know that he was a Hebrew and not Egyptian? Maybe he suspected, and maybe he gradually became known. But again, so he went out to where his people were. Some say that this one maybe he, but that is the writer's command. It may not be Moses actually went to see where his people were. He went to see, then as what we call as praying. Sometimes he might be assigned, and he watched them with the hard labor. And then he saw Egyptian beating a Hebrew, which is one of his own people. Did he know? Did he not know? Again, hard to say. And looking this way, that way, somehow he had compassion. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting and asked them, the one who was around, why are you hitting the Hebrews, fellow? And this man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? And Moses was afraid and thought, what I had done, they did, must have become known if they are saying this to me. So he was afraid. And when Pharaoh heard this, found out about it, he tried to kill Moses. Now, again, this is another kind of interesting situation. Moses is part of the royal court as a prince, and won't he be immune to prosecution of killing somebody? The son of the sultan of one of the states and shot the guy, and nothing is done. See, sometimes royalty can do things and get away with it, right? And so if Moses is one of the princes of Egypt, who cares? The one who died, and it might be one of them, but he is not a noble. He's not. Maybe he is. Maybe he's one of the noble family, whatever it is. But perhaps by this time Pharaoh was concerned because one of his princes suspected of what we call kind of questionable origins, ancestry, maybe one of him sided against the Hebrew slaves and killed one of the Egyptians. And he find that is treason, and Moses had to die. So try to kill him, execute him, because even though he was a prince, he was never really born. He was an adopted son. He was an adopted prince, and never really part of the natural Egyptian ancestry, royal family, royal blood. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat by the well. Midian is a very interesting situation. Midian is one of the sons of Abraham. Let's basically Midian then goes back to, and I don't have the reference, and remember then Abraham had another wife, and besides, and after Sarah died, he took a wife, Keturah, and she had born him son, and one of the sons was Midian. And Midian so is a close relation, somehow cousins, and a closer related, not that close, and to then the Israelites, say. But Midianites and later on were also seen as enemies of the Israelites. And so it's a very kind of complicated situation. And it was the Midianites who sold Joseph to the Egyptians, into Egypt. So this is a very kind. But anyway, this Midian was a priest. And Prince of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water, to fill the troughs with water, father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away. Now, it's unusual for girls to become shepherdess unless they have no sons. And if they become shepherdess and to care, they are always been bullied by other shepherds. And so because they are simply girls. And some shepherds came along, drove them away, but Moses got up and to the rescue and watered the flock. When the girls returned to Ruel, their father, Ruel means friend of God. The name means friend of God, companion of God. The father, why have you come to return so early? And they answered, and the Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. Now, definitely Moses looked like Egyptian. He doesn't like Hebrew anyway. Where is he? Ruel asked, why are you living there? kind of comedic then situation. Invite him to have something to eat. And so Moses agreed to stay with a man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And probably this will have later on he fell in love with Zipporah or whatever it is, and Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom. Gershom means a sojourner there. And so say I become a foreigner in a foreign land. Okay. Now going back, you'll find that when Moses became an adult, he went out to his people, maybe knowing or maybe not, maybe suspecting, maybe he know from his sister and maybe their connections and remember you are Hebrew. And maybe he was a compassionate person. He tried to act on behalf of enslaved people. And they didn't appreciate it. They turned against him. Who made you judge? Who made you king over and a ruler over us? And it kind of anticipates and look forward to later his role. The Israelites also did many times complain against Moses. So it gives a little bit of the kind of life that Moses will have. But he left Egypt, went to Midian, which is also a kind of precursor of the Israelites leaving Egypt eventually. And there he was in the desert for 40 years. And the book of Acts says that. And the Israelites was in the wilderness for 40 years. So he was being prepared by God in that sense. So time passed. During that long period, finally the king of Egypt died. And now we have to notice that Israelites grown in their slavery, they cried out, they cried for help because of slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning. Now God is mentioned. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. So he looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Now, I don't think that it was only after this time that the Jewish people, the Israelites, prayed to God. They might have been praying to God all this time. And the Israelites have been groaning to the slavery. And for 40 years, for many years, and they'll cry out to God and asking God, and their cry. But the time for deliverance have to wait until God prepare his man, the man he will bring them out. I think there are some lessons that I think we can learn here. And one of the practical lessons is that sometimes when we cry to God, we think God must come to us immediately. Sometimes we pray and pray, and 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years, 10 years, and still God doesn't answer. We think God has abandoned us. But God sometimes has his own timetable. He cannot be rushed. He will come at the right time. He'll come at the proper time. And so I think here, the scene is set, chapters 1 and 2, and as a prelude, a preparation, and for the revelation of God, and Moses becoming the deliverer that God would prepare, and how God prepared Moses When he became aware that he was a Hebrew, when he became aware of destiny, I think scripture doesn't really tell you. And a lot of things the Bible doesn't say. It tells us the very main points. Okay. All right. Okay. 9:30, just nice. And a little bit, took a bit longer, 5 minutes